This video will provide an overview of the operator instrument in Live. Now, operator is an FM-based synthesizer, and as such is somewhat counterintuitive and more complex than some of the other synths. What I'd like to do is to go through some of the inner workings of operator and how to get started with some basic sound design. As you'd expect, there are lots of presets that you can start off with and build up from. But what I'd like to do is to take the default operator and just drag and drop that onto a new MIDI track. We can see that it's loaded up the operator down the bottom here. The basic structure of operator is that there are 4 waveforms or oscillators labelled A, B, C, and D. And these 4 oscillators interact with one another, either by modulating each other or by being played back at the same time, and we can create a variety of sounds by combining them in different ways. Whichever tab I've got selected out of these 4 operators, or the global sections on the right hand side, those parameters are displayed in the middle area here. So for example, if I select operator A, we can see that we've got an envelope for that operator, as well as controls over the oscillator itself. So you can see there that the basic default oscillator is just a sine wave. We can change the envelope of this sine wave. But at the moment, we're only hearing one oscillator. What I'd like to do is I'd like to bring in my second oscillator by increasing the level above minus infinity dB of my oscillator B. And so you can see that depending on which tab I've got selected here, that will show me the envelope for a particular oscillator. So what's happening there is that my oscillator B is modulating the frequency of my oscillator A. And what we can do is change the tuning of my oscillator B to change the sound that modulation gives. For example, we can change the fine tuning like that. Or we can change the coarse tuning. In addition, we can change the envelope of just that B oscillator . So for example, if we have the decay set quite short and have the sustain set to minus infinity, we get sort of like a peak modulation at the start of every note, and the modulation itself fades out as the note progresses, but that A oscillator remains, and that's what we can hear as the note finishes. To make that effect a bit more obvious, what we can do is just increase the level of the oscillator, so of the B oscillator. Where things get complicated is that we can add oscillators C and D into the mix. So for example, if I bring up the level on oscillator C, can hear that changing the coarse and the fine tuning, as well as the levels of both B and C, is having an effect on the modulation that we hear in oscillator A. Finally, we can bring in a bit of oscillator D. And we can make more and more complex sounds by combining the level, the fine tuning, and the coarse tuning of these 4 oscillators. On the right-hand side, we have a number of global parameters. The first one is the LFO and the settings relating to the LFO. We can turn the LFO on to make sure we can hear it. And as a default, we can see that the amount is set to 25% and the rate is set to the value of 64. Now the LFO does have an envelope as well, and so we can just adjust that to change how quickly we hear those modulations kicking in. The next section is the filter. We can choose different filter types and different kinds of filters in terms of adding some distortion, and also the filter slope, or how steep the filter is. Finally, down the bottom, we have our global settings for things like volume, panning, and modulation type. Of interest in this section is the different configurations of how the 4 oscillators, A, B, C, and D, interact with one another. Let's just go through these options. There are many other parameters to explore in Operator. However, hopefully this is giving a good grounding in terms of how the different oscillators function with one another and the kinds of sounds that you can easily get out of this synthesizer.